negative feedback, how bad is the situation? How much corrective action do I need to take, and how quickly do I need to take that corrective action? Okay? That is the number one challenge. Well, how can I tell that? In France, I would be able to tell by the modulation of the tone of voice of my manager. The more up and down it goes, the worse the situation is. In Italy, how will you know how bad the situation is? Yeah, how much do the arms move? Okay? The more they move, the worse the situation is. In Canada, does that give you any indication? No, none whatsoever. What works in Canada? Well, in Canada, what works is the pattern that your manager uses to give you feedback. So typically, Canadian managers have 4 patterns. Okay? 1, 2, 3, 4. So the higher the number, the worse the situation is. Okay? And the pattern that you get is different depending on the position. So in position 1, what do you get? Well, you typically get a feedback sandwich. You know what I mean by that? Yes? A negative comment sandwiched between 2 positive comments. I like your report. It's full of mistakes, but you used a nice font. Okay? So, positive, negative, positive. Okay? Position 2, you get an open-face sandwich. Okay? The manager starts with a negative, still ends on a positive note. Position 3, it's all negative. Okay? There's no bread left. Position 4, you get 2 slices of meat for the price of 1. Okay? At that point, your manager is talking about consequences. If you don't change your behavior, something bad's going to happen, usually within 2 or 3 weeks. Okay? What is the issue for so many immigrants? Well, in many countries, I mean, France, Germany, Russia, China, India, Pakistan, Philippines, and so on, there is no equivalent to position 1 and 2. You get positive feedback, or you get negative feedback, but you do not get both at the same time. Okay? So, what do I do when I get a feedback sandwich? Well, I weigh the positive and the negative. If the positive outweighs the negative, what does it mean? I'm being praised, everything's fine. Is that the purpose of the meeting? No, it's to tell me what I need to change. Another example is the word but. You all know if you hear the word but in a sentence, whatever came before, ignore. Okay? That's complete filler. What comes after the word but is what really matters. Okay? Well, if I speak English as a second language, how am I supposed to know that? Okay? Somebody has to explain it to me, and it's not easy. How do Canadians learn it? They learn it through school. Okay? And so, what is really critical? Well, initially, what immigrants need to learn is how to find a job. Where do they fit? Where are their skills transferable? Okay? Once they get a job, they need to learn initiative. The number one issue when they get their first job during the probation period is keeping that job, because they're perceived as lacking initiative. Okay? It's also communication. Okay? Finding ways of communicating effectively with their managers, their colleagues, and so on. After they've gone through the probation period, typically they're put in a team, and the next issue becomes teamwork. What does being a good team player mean? Well, it means entirely different things in different parts of the world. Okay? And unfortunately, being a good team player by Chinese standards automatically makes you a poor team player by Canadian standards, and vice versa. Let me explain this one. The easiest way to think about it is compare a Chinese restaurant to a Canadian restaurant. Okay? If you're in a Chinese restaurant and you call a waiter or waitress, who comes? Whoever is closest. Okay? In a Chinese restaurant, you don't have waiters assigned to specific tables. Everybody waits on all clients. Okay? And there's only one tip box. Everybody puts the tips in there, and we share at the end of the shift. Okay? What happens in a Canadian restaurant? If you call a waiter who's not the one assigned at your table, what do they say? I'll go get your waiter or waitress. Okay? So in other words, I'm not your server. I will get the person who serves you. Okay? In a Canadian restaurant, I have my tables, you have yours, and we both get our tips from our own tables. So what happens when a Chinese immigrant works in a Canadian restaurant? They try to help, they try to serve whoever's there. Now, how are they perceived? They're perceived, one, as meddling in everybody's affairs. They're perceived as trying to get the tip from others. Okay? And their tables are not taken care of. Okay? So in other words, they're doing their best to help everybody, to be the best employee they can be, and they're perceived as very poor team player, and they're usually laid off very quickly. Okay? So, being a good team player means entirely different things in different parts of the world. Okay? Once people have gone through the, they got a job, they went through the probation period, they learn how to be a good team player, and that takes a long time. The next thing that people have to learn, in most cases, is how to promote themselves. Like, one of the key skills in Canada is how to make a good presentation. Okay? It's a fundamental skills in Canada. You can see the importance of a skill by how early kids in school are taught that skill. Okay? At what age does the average Canadian kid start learning to make public presentations? Kindergarten, show and tell. Okay? In my case in France, I made my first presentation in grade 9. Much, much later. Many Chinese engineers have told me they made their first presentation in university. Okay? No presentation before that. So what does that mean? Well, making a good presentation matters way less in France, in China, in Russia, in Germany, because there what matters is the written word. Canada is a visual culture. Okay? We have 500 channels of TV, and we read very little. Okay? The number of books that the average Canadian buys per year is very small compared with the number of books bought by the average French, German, Russian, or Chinese. Okay? So, what does it mean? Well, I can write a great report, but nobody's going to read it. I need to learn how to make a good presentation. And this is not easy, because even if I make good presentations in my home country, I have to learn how to make good presentations by Canadian standards. Let me illustrate this point with one joke. Okay? Some of you may have heard it, but 5 journalists from around the world were asked to write an article on elephant mating. Okay? So, the American journalist wrote an article that was entitled, "How to Make $1 Million by Mating Elephants." The French journalist wrote, "The Secret Love Life of Elephants." The German journalist wrote, "The Psychological and Sociological Dynamics of Elephant Mating." Part 1, from Karl the Great to Bismarck. Okay? The Chinese journalist wrote, "Chinese were the first to mate elephants in the Qing dynasty." Okay? The Canadian journalist wrote, "Elephant mating, a federal, provincial, or municipal responsibility." So, what point am I trying to make with that joke? Well, what is very clear is the same topic will be treated entirely differently in different parts of the world. So, all the soft skills that people have learned in their home countries need to be relearned in order to be effective in Canada. And that takes quite a bit of time. Okay? In my experience, it's a major challenge. And the problem, if I go back to, hold on a second. Perfect. If I go back to this situation, okay? So remember, we have this immigrant, this Canadian person got the job. This person interprets it as discrimination or unfairness, okay? What will the immigrant do in order to make himself or herself more promotable, more employable? Learn more technical skills. right? What do? They try to move in this direction. They try to get a higher degree. If they have a bachelor, they'll go for a master's. They have a master's, they'll go for a PhD. If they're in the financial industry, they'll get more letters after their name. Okay? MBA, CFA, or, and so on and so forth. Okay? I had an Iranian financial advisor. Every time I met with him, he had 3 more letters after his name. But he was impossible to deal with. He was telling me what I should buy. Okay? And I was not ready. I didn't have any money at the time. So the question was not what I should buy. I can't buy anything. Okay? So he was not able to understand this point. Okay? So it's a major, major challenge in my experience, meaning that people need to understand how to influence others. And it's very, very difficult. Okay? Because many immigrants were in such a high social position when they were in their home country. Okay? The way I like to illustrate this point is like this. Okay? So I'm going to use India because I know the numbers. But you can replace India by just about any other country and you'll get the same picture. So we're going to compare Canada, India, and we're going to look at 2 numbers. GDP per capita. Okay? And the starting salary of professionals. Can somebody give me a glass of water, please? Okay. So, GDP per capita, I think everybody knows what I mean by that. Gross domestic product. It's a measure of it's an actual measure of the size of the economy. But I'm going to use that number as a measure of the average income in both countries. It's not an exact measure, and I've had engineers take me to task for that. But it's close enough, okay? The 2 numbers differ by less than 10%, okay? Starting salary of professionals, I'm talking about anybody who's got a bachelor. When they graduate, what kind of salary can they expect, okay? Like when they graduate from a university with their bachelor, what kind of salary can they expect, okay? So and this is horseshoes and hand grenades, okay? Close counts, okay? So, let's start with the GDP per capita of Canada. Does anybody have any idea what the GDP per capita of Canada is? In round numbers, it's $40,000 a year. Okay? So the average Canadian makes roughly $40,000 a year. If you graduate with a bachelor in Canada, what kind of salary can you expect? It will depend on what kind of bachelor you get and where you go in the country, okay? On the low end of the spectrum, you might be at 30, 35. You can go up to 70 if you have a Bachelor of Engineering and you go to Fort McMurray, okay? So let's use this range, say $35,000 to $70,000 a year, okay? Now let's go to India. What is the GDP per capita of India? Well, it's round numbers, it's $1,000 a year. The average Indian makes roughly $1,000 a year. Now, $1,000 in India goes farther than $1,000 in Canada. Okay? What you can buy with $1,000 in India is equivalent to what you can buy with $5,000 in Canada. Okay? If you had $5,000 a year in Canada, what kind of a lifestyle would you have? Not too good, right? In India, with $1,000 a year, you can live. Not like a king or a queen, but you can live. Here, $5,000 a year, you live under a bridge. Okay, I mean, it's like... Now comes the very important number. What is the starting salary of professionals in India? I've asked a number of engineers, accountants, and pharmacists, and what I get is a range of $10,000 to $15,000 a year. Okay? And many of you who come who are immigrants yourself, I'm sure you know what I'm talking about. What I mean by that is the social position of a professional is way higher in the countries where immigrants come from compared with what it is in Canada. Okay? In India, if I'm a professional with my first paycheck, like I just got my bachelor and I got my first paycheck, I can hire 2 or 3 people to work for me. I won't have to wash dishes. I won't have to clean my clothes. I won't have to dust. Somebody will take care of all that for me. Okay? I will work very long hours, but I will not take care of household tasks. Okay? So the social position of a professional is way higher in the countries of origin of most immigrants than it is in Canada. And what that means is, when you're working with them, this is a big challenge. Because when they come here, they will not, they want to get to the same level as what they had before. Okay? Remember the, let me find this chart for a second. We talked about progress as a function of time. Where did I put it? This one. Okay? Remember I said it takes 6 to 12 years in my experience to get back to the level where you would have been if you had stayed back home. How much time does the average immigrant thinks it's going to take him or her when he or she lands in Canada? 3 months? Yeah, maximum 2 years. Okay? So there's a huge gap of expectations between what they think is going to happen and what will actually happen. Okay? So this is a major challenge. And the problem is, so they think that this is going to take only 2 years, and they're trying to get back to this social position, which is so high that there is actually no equivalent position in Canadian society. If you think of society as a pyramid, so what I'm going to compare the Indian pyramid to the Canadian pyramid. Okay, what is it going to look like? Well, the Canadian pyramid is very small relative to the Indian pyramid because we only have 33 million people in Canada and we have 1.1 billion in India. Okay? So relative to the Canadian pyramid, the Indian pyramid kind of looks like this. Okay? It's huge. Okay, I put the tip a little too high, but it's very big. The bottom of the pyramid Indian pyramid is much lower than the bottom of the Canadian pyramid because we have, the average is $1,000 a year. So in India, you have, 200 or 300 million people who live on less than $1 a day. They're basically at survival level. Okay? They've got enough food for today, wonderful. Tomorrow, they will worry about what they eat for breakfast. And $1,000 a day means $100 a month. So for $100 a month, you can hire somebody full-time. Okay? Now, the top of the Indian pyramid is higher than the top of the Canadian pyramid. I put it a little too high, but it is higher. Why is that? The richest Canadian is David Thompson, the son of Ken Thompson. On the list of richest people in the world, he's number 16. There are 3 or 4 Indians in the list of top 10 richest people in the world. Now, I'm saying 3 or 4 because it depends whether you count Mittal as being British or Indian. Mittal is the owner of the steel company Mittal Steel that bought the steel company Arcelor that bought Dofasco. He spent $50 million on his daughter's wedding. So let's put it this way, he's doing all right. Okay? So, now, if you have a bachelor in India or many of the countries you come from, where are you on this pyramid? Well, you are in a social position that is so high that there is no equivalent in Canadian society. You will be treated with a deference that in Canada, even the Prime Minister will never experience that. Okay? I mean, just to give you an example, I'm going to use, this happened to a client of mine. He's the American CEO of a software development company. He went to India to negotiate an offshoring agreement. He had allocated a week for the negotiation. The negotiation go on, and it gets down to the wire. About 2 hours before it's time for him to leave to catch his flight, he tells his Indian counterpart, look, I'm going to have to leave pretty soon to catch my flight. The Indian CEO responded, don't worry, we'll take care of that. The American CEO wondered what he meant by that, but figured it's too close. I'd rather make sure that we finish the deal, and even if it means I might miss my flight, rather than have to come all the way back from San Francisco to finish the deal. He arrived at the airport an hour and a half after the scheduled departure time of his flight. The flight was waiting for him. The flight was not late, the flight was waiting for him. Okay? He arrived at the counter. Somebody said, "Are you Mr. So-and-so?" He said, "Yes." They whisked him through the airport, straight to the plane, no security check, nothing. Okay? Why? Because the Indian CEO had called the airport manager and asked him, "Please hold flight number XYZ for Mr. So-and-so." Now, have you ever tried to ask Air Canada to hold a flight for you? They may be late, but they're not waiting for you. Okay? Now, I told the same story last month in a business school in Switzerland. And one Russian student raised his hand and he said, "Oh, in Russia we beat that." So I asked him, "Well, what does he mean by that?" Well, he said, there was a Russian governor, the equivalent of a Canadian premier, who missed his flight. The plane had already taken off by the time he arrived at the airport. He called the KGB to ask them to call the airline to have the plane turn around and come back. And they did. Okay? So, the equivalent in Canada is this. Dalton McGuinty misses his flight at Pearson. Calls the RCMP to have them call Air Canada to have the flight turn around and come back.